Good morning. I'm Arlie Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for December 13th, 2022. Over the last days, I've been promising to give you an update on developments in the financial world, which are quite ominous. And I'll get to that in a moment, but there's something even more ominous that we have to talk about first, which is the threat of a nuclear war. Now, I know many of you don't like to talk about this because you say it's either not going to happen or there's nothing you can do about it. But the fact is that we are moving closer and closer to the point at which such an event becomes inevitable by miscalculation or accident or evil intent if nothing's done to remove the cause of this. So I want to call your attention to an urgent update issued by Helga Zepp-LaRouche on behalf of the Schiller Institute for a call for immediate diplomatic negotiations to end the Ukrainian war. Now, this is triggered in part by a statement from Joe Biden in the last weeks, where he said the U.S. no longer intends that its nuclear force will serve only as a deterrent, but may be an option to respond to what he called non-nuclear threats. In other words, to use our nuclear capability as a first strike weapon, something that could be used to preempt or respond to what seems to be a danger of a war. Now, this is extremely destabilizing, and it was responded to almost immediately by Russia's President Putin, who at a press conference on December 9th said Russia now must reconsider its nuclear doctrine. Russia's nuclear doctrine is that its nuclear weapons exist only as a deterrent under circumstances in which its existence as a nation are threatened. Now he's saying that they must they must consider moving to match the U.S. nuclear doctrine. In other words, a first strike capability. This places the world closer than ever to the potential of a nuclear war, as I said, by accident, mistake, or evil intent. So it makes a diplomatic settlement of the Ukrainian war even more necessary now, not just to stop the slaughter, but to stop the slide toward these circumstances where an escalation becomes almost inevitable. And in this light, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, on behalf of the Schiller Institute, has drafted a statement endorsing the offer of Pope Francis to use the venue of the Vatican for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to reach a diplomatic solution to the war. I'm going to put a link to Helga's statement at the bottom of the description page so that you can read it and circulate it. It's a short statement, and it essentially demands that governments move now to shift this crisis from a war to a diplomatic resolution. The Russians have said they're willing to do it. The Ukrainians have said they're not. And they're backed by the British and NATO forces, who are saying that there can be no solution until Russia is defeated. So it's incumbent upon us in the so-called West to demand of governments that they not sacrifice the human race for the sake of their corruption and their attempt to sustain a unipolar order which is losing favor worldwide and is in danger of collapse. So join our efforts to demand that governments engage in a diplomatic solution. Helga ends her statement with a reference to the choral singing going on by the LaRouche organization at many venues of the song Dona Nobis Pacem, Give Us Peace. And she ends her statement by saying, may the voices for peace move the hearts and minds of those responsible, unquote. These are stubborn minds and hard hearts, but we represent the majority, including in the West, and by far the majority in terms of the global South. So it's incumbent on us to make this extra effort to get a diplomatic resolution moving. Now, let me go to a quick review of some of the economic financial developments. Remember that behind the war danger is the ongoing collapse of the Anglo-American global economic system, which is based on neoliberal economic policies, deregulation, an end to sovereign nation states, and that the threat to that system is coming from the emergence of a potentially new system to replace the petrodollar system centered in the works of Russia and China, organizations such as the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others. So let's review the financial crisis quickly. And I'm going to refer first to an article in Wall Street on Parade about the FTX scandal. Now, this is not an anomaly, but it's an example of the systemic corruption of the system. The focus on Bankman-Fried is, now that he's been arrested, this is going to be the focus. But the real issue is, how was this allowed to happen when it was such a blatant example of a Ponzi scheme? Now, the reason I say it's systemic is that what the Wall Street on Parade points out is that the legal advisor on FTX bankruptcy in their court is the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the most prominent firms involved in financial affairs. And there's a conflict of interest here because a former partner of Sullivan and Cromwell, Ryan Miller, has been serving as the general counsel of FTX. Before going to FTX, Miller served as co-chairman of Sullivan and Cromwell's Commodities, Futures, and Derivatives Group. So here you see the integration of the law firms, which represent the major banks, also representing this crypto trading platform that went bankrupt. Now, the report from yesterday's Wall Street on Parade says that there are demands coming from the media for transparency. And that's because the list of creditors has been sealed by the bankruptcy court. Well, the question is posed then by the U.S. bankruptcy trustee, Andrew Vara, that an investigation must be made and it must be transparent. How does a company with a valuation at the beginning of 2022 of $32 billion collapse in 8 days in November, vaporize, taking with it many, many people's investments? Vara called this the fastest big corporate failure in American history. And he wrote that, quote, "The substantial and serious allegations of fraud, dishonesty, incompetence, misconduct, and mismanagement all must be investigated." And he asks, was this an unsuccessful business or a successful fraud? Now, in response to this collapse, the Securities and Exchange Commission has ordered all publicly traded companies with relationships with cryptocurrency firms in financial distress or going into bankruptcy to make disclosures. Now, this brings up a question. Why are such disclosures not part of a standard regulatory framework? In other words, this was allowed to occur, and this should not have occurred according to the 2010 Dodd-Frank regulations. Was this just a slip-up, or were those regulations not meant to do anything, as is likely the case? Now, the signs of the crisis are affecting the major banks. One, for example, Credit Suisse, the second largest Swiss bank, their stock hit an all-time low on December 1st. And this is due to the skyrocketing prices of the cost of credit default swaps, which are essentially insurance on their derivative trade. And the credit default swaps insure against a debt default by Credit Suisse. The swaps are being purchased by major banks, which are counterparties with Credit Suisse in derivative trades. That is insurance, which means the banks are betting that they better get their insurance up to date because the collapse is impending. This coheres with a report from the Bank for International Settlements about derivative debt that's held in off-balance sheet that's held off balance sheet by foreign banks that are involved in trading with US banks. It's estimated that the off balance sheet total is $39 trillion. Now, in 2008 and 2020, foreign banks were among those bailed out in the huge bailouts, 29 trillion or so in after 2008. And it's estimated now that more than 20 trillion in the 2020-21 bailout. A lot of that went to foreign institutions that were listed as counterparties to US banks when it comes to derivative transactions. And the reason they're bailed out is that they are primary dealers in selling US Treasuries. That is, when the US Treasury issues its debt, a portion of that debt is purchased by these foreign banks. The US counterparties in these off-balance sheet deals are the 5 big US derivative banks: JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Bank of America, and Morgan Stanley. Now, what this shows is that the economy as a whole, as Lyndon LaRouche warned would happen after the 1971 change of junking the Bretton Woods system and the gold reserve basis for the dollar, LaRouche warned that we would end up in a global casino economy with one after another Ponzi scheme, as speculators have access to credit, but those engaged in real physical production are shut off, which has happened increasingly over the last 30 years. That is, the whole economy is collapsing under the weight of debt, which has been built up by bailouts, sometimes called quantitative easing. Now, if you want to address this, you have to go with LaRouche's 4 laws. That is, a return to Glass-Steagall regulation, which does not allow commercial banks to engage in such speculation. Secondly, establish a national credit bank, a Hamiltonian credit bank, which guarantees credit for physical goods production, but not for speculation. Third, you need infrastructure spending. We need to upgrade the platform of infrastructure of the US economy urgently. And finally, investment in the frontiers of science and technology, which is where you add future value to the economy, so that you're not just printing paper as monetary aggregates to back up these skyrocketing financial aggregates, which means that in order to keep them liquid, you're making them more insolvent by adding to their total debt. That's what's happened, especially since the 2003, 4, 5 period that created the 2008 blowout, and then the post-2019, 2020 blowout. We've just, through quantitative easing, given more money to firms that are essentially bankrupt, increasing their debt. That's why we have these 2 urgent crises: the impending collapse of the financial system and the drive by the banks that are, and hedge funds and institutions that are involved in this collapse, to prevent an alternative system from coming into being, if necessary, by resorting to war and possibly even nuclear war. So take the link from the bottom of the description page today, read it and circulate it, and join our mobilization. Thanks for joining me today. I'll be back again tomorrow.